And welcome again to another episode of the Endurance Physios podcast. My name is Dr. Sam Rockwater. I am joined, as always, by Dr. Will Gonzaba. Howdy, Will.
What's going on, Sam?
Not much. Today, we have a pertinent topic because it is starting to get warm in Arizona, and it is starting to get warm, I imagine, in San Antonio. Not everywhere in the U.S. is it warm yet, though. I know I saw some snow up in Montana and Minnesota today, so hopefully it'll get warm soon, but good things to talk about because we are talking about heat training today. Today's topic, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of heat training, how to train in the heat, because that's also very important. I got a great story about how not to train in the heat. And then we talk just real quickly about heat-related illnesses. So lots to cover here. Let's start with the pros and cons. More specifically, let's start with the pros. What are the biggest reasons to train in the heat? You know, some people do come to Arizona. I know some people probably come to Texas a little bit. I know when I was living down in Tucson, Arizona, it was a big hotbed for triathletes to come out there prior to going to Kona, Ironman Kona or the Ironman World Championships. But what are some of the biggest pros, Will, for heat training?
Yeah, sure. I think depending on where you live, it just is a necessity if you want to continue to train. So sometimes you don't have an option, like you just got to do it. So it's just what you have. So there's that obvious one. But there are actually some physiological benefits to training in the heat, right? A lot of times we just think about like suffering through the hot summers of training, but there are actually some advantages to doing it. In fact, one of the coaches here, he calls it the poor man's altitude training. So that makes me feel better about it. That's what I tell myself when I'm suffering through 110 degree days. But there are some benefits, right? So there are some actual things that it can help with. And so that's, I was doing some research on it, and there's studies that show that training in the heat over the course of 2 weeks can help improve your VO2 max and lactate threshold when you go back to training at a normal temperature, right? Or what would be a considered high heat, right? So something below 90 degrees. So when you train in that temperature, you're going to get those adaptations because your body is under more stress during that time. And so you're going to get those physiological adaptations. So there is something to that, right? But that being said, there's still right and wrong ways to do it. Like you can't just go out and run all of your workouts or ride all of your workouts out in the heat because there could definitely be some downsides to it as well. But when done properly, there are some physiological adaptations that you can get. Real quick,
can you explain lactate threshold and what that is for people? And VO2 max super briefly.
Oh man.
I'm putting you on the spot. Otherwise I certainly can, but I feel
like you would do a better job of doing it briefly versus me.
No problem. VO2 max. Essentially, VO2 max is a measurement, a lab measurement that we use to essentially test how much aerobic endurance and capacity you have. Oftentimes, you're hooked up to a machine. You might have seen it on like Gatorade commercials or something like that, where the person is running on a treadmill. They got a big old mask over their face with tubes coming out of it, and they're running essentially to exhaustion. That air goes through a little computer and system, and it spits out a number. And that VO2 max oftentimes is just it's a measure of your aerobic capacity. So the higher your VO2 max, the higher aerobic capacity you have. That's VO2 max at like 10,000 feet. There's so much more to it, but that's 10,000 feet. Lactate threshold. I'm going to try and not get too nerdy with this one, but lactate threshold, essentially when you are exercising, your muscles, how can I say this? There's a thing called the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle is how your muscles get energy. One of the spin-offs of the Krebs cycle is called lactate or lactic acid. And essentially what happens is your body kind of naturally buffers that acid. And essentially, if you're able to buffer that acid, you can continue. So think about it like if you're cycling or if you're running or if you're swimming and you kind of feel like a burning sensation in your muscles, that's actually just your lactate or lactic acid has built up so much where you can't buffer it out so like fast enough, if that makes sense. So your lactate threshold is that line where it goes from being able to essentially buffer that lactic acid or that lactate out versus keeping it or like having excess lactic acid, which creates the burn. So when people fatigue, especially at threshold, that's often due to lactic acid production, not necessarily due to muscle fatigue all the time. So that's the burning. Hopefully that's a quick overview. Sorry to put you on the spot there, Will, but hopefully that makes some sense. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you wanted to add on anything on to that, but those are the two things. So coming back and circling back to it, heat training can help improve both that VO2 max, very, very minimally, by the way, very minimally, but it also too can improve that lactate threshold, which minimally to some may say significantly in the heat. And that's, I think, what most endurance athletes, when they go into heat training, are trying to shoot for, is that increase in lactate thresholds so then they can essentially endure or suffer a little bit more.
Right. So no, not putting me on the spot at all, man. You just explained it way better than I thought I could. So that was great. But yeah, that's I think a great summary. Just being honest. It's all good, man. Great summary. What you are. Yeah. So I think those are some of the pros I came across in the research. The other one is that sometimes you have to do it to replicate what your race environment is going to be like. So for us in these hotter climates, almost year round, it's not as much of a thing because, like I said, it's like your only option to train. A lot of our races, it's hot and humid, so you're just training in what you're going to race in. But that's not the case for everybody, right? So people that are training for some of these ultras that are held in the summer or late spring, where you might hit over 90 degrees, close to 100 degrees, like some of these athletes that live at elevation elsewhere or in more mild climates are going to have to travel to just get adapted to training at these higher temperatures, or racing at these higher temperatures, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, replicating race environments, that's exactly why all those triathletes would fly down to Tucson, would be to just get that heat and that dry heat, which was somewhat similar to Kona. Now, obviously, Kona is on the island of Hawaii, the big island of Hawaii, which also has the ocean right there. But in terms of heat, it felt somewhat similar, and it was much cheaper to fly to Tucson, Arizona and train in Tucson than it would be to fly for a month out to Hawaii and that kind of thing. But those are also the only pros that I really have as well. I mean, not saying that those aren't like good pros, but let's talk about the cons a little bit.
Yeah.
And I know,
it's not like
I know just myself. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it's not like in terms of it being a short pro list, like it's not, like it's just not very extensive. It's hard to come up with of reasons to do it.
Yeah, heat training for sure. There's those reasons though are pretty good. I would say the biggest thing, at least for myself, the biggest con is like the quality of exercise might be diminished, and I think I've obviously experienced that a little bit. I've also too, we also have on the list here that it can be dangerous as well. I'll give you a quick story time by Sam here. Quick story. Essentially, I was new to Arizona, and this is so dumb in hindsight, but I was new to Arizona, and I wanted to go out for, it was like end of September, and I wanted to go out for a bike ride out kind of northeast of Phoenix. We're up in Phoenix for the weekend and whatever. And so I went out for a ride, and I mapped out this like 70-mile ride with, I think it was like 5,000 feet of elevation. But also too, I was riding all year, so shouldn't be too much. Should be a big ride, big day, but nothing crazy. I went out there. I packed my two biggest water bottles in my bike. And then I also had a 3-liter hydration pack on the back. So I had about roughly 4 liters of water, 4.5 to 5 liters of water on me. And I also mapped out and made sure that there was water spots, there was lakes, there was some streams and stuff like that. What I didn't know is that in Arizona in September, most of those lakes and streams and water spots are completely dried up. And or I came across this little like well, and it actually had 2 locks on it, not one but 2 locks on
Oh,
it.
jeez.
And so I made it. What was it, like 30, 25, 26 miles, and I already had like almost 3,000 feet of the elevation done. And so I was getting close to running out of water, but I'm like, oh, it's all good. Like hydration packs out. I still got 2 water bottles, and also 2 I should be in to my next 2 spots should be both within the next 10 miles. And it turns out neither one of them were in the next 2 miles. So I descended down this big mountain, down in to try and get these water spots, and didn't have them, and ended up just turning around because I'm like, this is one giant loop. I would just need to turn around. It's faster. It'll be 50 miles versus 70 miles. Although I do still have to climb all the way back up. Ended up going there and stopped actually at a trailhead. And thank goodness somebody randomly turned in, because I, at this point, saw one other car the entire ride. And now this one car comes into the trailhead and looks at me, and I'm like on like the concrete in some sort of like shade area. And they're like, hey, you're not looking so good. You need some water? I'm like, yes, please. And essentially brought me back to life. I made it back to our house where we were staying. And I just remember I had the biggest headache. I didn't pee for like 6 hours, and I was just pumping fluids. I went and got Gatorade. I went and got food. I just felt awful. Definitely had some heat exhaustion for sure, maybe borderline heat stroke, which we'll talk about more. But anyways, biggest thing to take away from that is that training in the heat can be extremely dangerous, and if not life-threatening at times, depending on what you're doing and where you're going. But that was really dumb. I know now to not ever do that again, and to make sure that it's either winter or I have SAG or I have some other form of water on board. So anyways, long-winded story.
Yeah,
Sorry, Will.
I think
But
no, no, man. I've got definitely my fair share of these heat scares for sure. And I think anyone who trains in these hotter environments, like sadly, like I think at some point you're probably going to have an episode where you're in heat exhaustion, and hopefully not much
yeah,
past that. But I think it just comes by nature of the beast. And I know for mine, like the time I had it worst, I was new to competitive cycling, and a friend asked me to go on. It was our Tuesday night, our Tuesday nighter, right? I had no idea what the Tuesday nighter ride was. I thought it was just like a 40-mile ride, but it's like it's like a hammer fest the entire time.
yeah,
And it's like 5:30 in the afternoon, slugfest. It's on black tarmac, so it's just hot,
mm-hmm.
exposed the whole time. And so not only was I way outgunned that whole time, but it was just so hot, and I didn't hydrate at all. Like I didn't know how to hydrate properly before, probably during. And I remember like getting home that night and from that ride and feeling like I couldn't stop shivering. Like I had same thing, pounding headache, nauseous, just like couldn't hold anything down. Like it is just the worst feeling. It's the worst feeling. Like it sucks. But unfortunately, like
Yeah,
you're probably going to be there. People will probably be there at some point. But hopefully, hey, maybe pick up a tip or two from our podcast today and figure out how to avoid it, because it's not a fun state to be in at all.
absolutely.
But yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah, it can definitely be dangerous. And I think even like you think of people that are, I mean, these are sad stories, dude. Like people going out to the state parks and on hikes in the summer and not bringing water and like dying on the trail with their family. Like you had a story like that last year, somewhere out west. I forgot where that was, but it can certainly happen. So you just got to be aware of these things, right? And definitely plan ahead. I think that definitely like it being dangerous, it's a big con. Another thing on the quality of your exercise being diminished, kind of spinning off of that, is that for those of us who are doing structured training, the temperature outside and the humidity outside can make it very hard to train within specific zones. So, your aerobic run it's going to have your heart rate that's way higher. And so now if you're trying to do threshold work or whatever it might be, it's just going to be very, very hard to stay within your desired heart rate training zones. If that's how you're doing it. So thereby, like, the quality of your exercise is going to be diminished because it's going to be harder to hit the zones that you need. And also, if you just think of like a recovery standpoint, like trying to bring the heart rate back down and actually feel like your heart rate is returning to a manageable spot before you give another effort, like that time is going to be longer. It might not happen at all if it's hot enough. So all of those things can just really jeopardize the overall quality of the workout itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we also, I know that maintaining training zones, especially heart rate zones, in the heat is much, much harder to be able to do. And I think, I just, kind of laugh every time when I go out and, it's like 100 and whatever, 3 at 7 a.m. or whatever. And I try and get out for like an hour and, I'm just profusely sweating and my heart rate is like through the roof because it's just hot outside and I'm going, man, I'm pushing like 150 watts and my heart rate's like 160, like what is going on? But I think that can definitely happen. And I think, the last con that I know that we kind of pre-talked about was like the increased blood flow to thermoregulate your body temp, which essentially means that your body is shuttling more blood to your skin to attempt to try and cool it down, and it results in a decreased blood flow to like working for your muscles and other things because it's trying to shed heat. And that's a survival mechanism when we kind of break it down and look back at it. But that's also too, though, part of why we get that improved VO2 max and improved lactate threshold from there. But it's just something where you have to really watch because that thermoregulation is so important, and it's going to take up a lot of that blood flow to try and help circulate and try and cool you down as best as possible. But that's those I would say are like all the cons that, we can think of at least right off the bat here. Is there anything else that you think of like right off the bat here for cons?
This is more of like a logistic thing that I thought about just now, is like for us, like where it's kind of hot all day from the beginning to the end, like your workout window of where to fit your workout in during the day is really narrow because basically it has to be done first thing in the morning. And as it gets later, it just gets harder to get it done, or impossible if the temperature is over 115 or 110, whatever it might be. So your workout windows of which to be compliant with your exercise plan, if you're going to work out outside, are a lot smaller, as opposed to the winter where maybe you could ride in the afternoon, maybe in the evening, maybe in the morning. You can kind of make it work at any time. In the summer, you might not have that luxury.
Sure. Yeah. 100%. I know in Phoenix in the summer, I'm working out at 4 a.m. From 4 to 6, maybe 4 to 7 if I need to get like a long 3-hour ride in. And at 7, the sun is up and it is pounding and it is like 105, 108 already. Even at that time at 4 a.m., I've had it read 103 and I'm like, this is ridiculous. What am I doing? Maybe I should sit on the trainer. And then I'm like, I can't do a 3-hour ride on the trainer I give. But let's because because I just don't like trainers all that much. Let's talk about how to train in the heat. How have you trained in the heat prior to, or like before? How is that kind of evolving for you? What are you doing?
I used to be very finicky about it, and I would try to really, really avoid it. And now I'm trying to embrace it in smart ways because I'm not moving from Texas anytime soon, and the summer's not going to get any lighter. So you might as well just kind of get used to it in some ways. But there are definitely some things that I try to incorporate. And I think the big one, and I think this is a good one for most people to take, is to really focus on doing your aerobic workouts. So like your endurance ones, the longer, easier ones, and outside, right? So your longer rides, your longer runs, try to get them done early before it gets super hot. That's a basic thing, but you can still have a pretty good quality workout. Even though your heart rate might be a little bit higher than what it would be in a cooler temperature, you're still going to get the nice physiological adaptations from performing the aerobic workout outside. Now, when it comes to doing things outside of that zone, so doing, any sort of threshold workout or VO2 max workout, personally, like I'm going to take that inside and I'm going to do it on the trainer. Or if I can't get it done first thing in the morning, right? So just really trying to focus on the easier intensity rides and runs to be done outside. That's a big one. What about you? How do you kind of get back into summer training?
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely try and get my aerobic rides outside. I actually do a lot of like Zwift races in the summer to try and get my intensity in. But again, though, I have like 5 fans on me and my AC is blasting at me. So I really try and get all my high intensity stuff done inside, and try and get my kind of lower intensity, longer distance rides done outside if I can, where I can tolerate that a little bit better. But also too, the other thing that I'll try and do and incorporate is as the temperatures continue to increase and increase, I'll really try and slowly ramp up that exposure to that heat over the course of like 2 to 4 weeks. So I'm not going to go out in the middle of summer when I haven't done any training at all, or haven't done any training outside at all for a while, and just like go guns blazing. I'll try and get it in, before the sun comes up, when it's still, 95, 100 degrees in Phoenix, which sounds awful, but I'll try and get that in then, and then slowly push my workouts back and back, maybe to where I'm going from like 6 to 8 if I'm really trying to work on like that heat adaptation. I'm also too, though, making sure I choose places where I can also hydrate very, very, very frequently. And so I'll have like a 3-liter on my back. I'll have 2 water bottles in there. I'm so hyper paranoid now about hydration after that heat incident that I talked about. But that's kind of what I've been doing now, is I'm trying to hydrate as much as I can during the ride, and starting kind of slow and gradual and kind of working up from there. What about you when you first start into it?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think we're lucky in some ways in that at least the past 2 years, I can think of our springs like gradually ramped up in temperature to the summer versus it being like hot and cold, hot and cold. So I think if you just continue to do the rides you were doing in the winter and the spring outside, you kind of just continue it through the weekends, and then eventually it just gets hotter, hotter, hotter as you go. And so it lends itself to a nice progression of exposure to the temperature. So I think that's an important thing, as you mentioned. But man, the hydration thing for sure. And I've actually gotten a lot more. I'm not super scientific about it, but definitely trying to dial that in a lot more, because I've noticed it just making a huge difference. And so like the 2 years ago, one thing I started doing was the hydration vest during the longer rides. And even if it's just like a 3-hour ride, like I'm going to go through 2 water bottles super quick. So the hydration pack, just having more fluids, that helped a ton. But then starting to do like, really pay attention to the amount of sodium that's within your electrolytes. So, you can do like these sodium sweat tests. So I did one of those last year, which will basically just tell you the density of sodium within your sweat while you're exercising. So it lets you know how much sweat you're losing throughout an hour of exercise, right? So it tells you how salty of a sweater you are. And that's important because you want to be able to replenish that. And not all electrolyte drinks have the same amount of sodium. And so for me, I'm not the saltiest sweater, but I'm up there in like the higher categories. And so switching to like Element or Element-T, however you want to say it, like that made a big difference because it has a super high density of sodium. So I felt way better when I would work out outside. Like it's still hot, but I think I really noticed in my ability to recover that evening, and then leading into the next day, I didn't really have that hungover type of feeling. So I think that's something that anyone who trains in hot temperatures should really invest in those sodium sweat tests. We have a dietitian here in town, or who we work with, who does them, but they also have these ones that you can buy online. I think they're called NIX sodium sweat test. And you can just do the test yourself and figure out how much sodium you're losing, and making sure that the electrolytes that you're taking in are replenishing what you're putting out. So that was super helpful for me. The other thing was how I changed my daily hydration. And so I was always of the mindset, you just kind of start drinking water throughout the clinic day. You're talking a lot, so I'm drinking a lot of water. And I always assumed once I started peeing clear that I was good to go. Like I was like, hey, you're properly hydrated. We can go outside and exercise. But after working with our dietitian, I learned that was not right. I was actually diluting the electrolytes in my system. So I make it a point to also take in electrolytes during the day if I'm going to be working out in the evening when it's hot outside, or just as a daily practice during the summer, because really you want your urine to be like a lemonade color, like a light yellow. And if you're taking in electrolytes during the day, that can help with that. And so again, you're just kind of building up your reserve of those electrolytes. So when you go out and you're sweating more because it's hot outside, like you're going to make sure that you're prepared for that, or your body's prepared for that. So I think those are definitely things that people need to look into and pay attention to while you're training in the summer.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know that I did actually buy one of those little devices for sweat tests, so I'm really curious. I haven't tried it out yet because in the winter it's totally different than in the summer and the amount of sweat that you have. And so I don't know if sweat composition is different, which would be kind of interesting. I'll kind of check and see.
Interesting.
Maybe I should do one soon then. But yeah, I'm kind of curious to see how that helps me. But the real question, Will,
Hey, dude,
is how hot is too hot?
Yeah, I was going to say you're really going to like the sodium. I was just going to say you're going to really like the sodium testing, or the sweat testing, the sodium composition test. How hot is too hot? So yeah, I did not the Nix one, but I did like the one through our dietitian where she has some sort of fancy device and they hook it up to your forearm, and they measure the concentration of sodium that way. So I did that.
Nice.
But I'm pretty sure that's like the, kind of the gold standard medical grade equipment that she was using. So I don't know how it compares to the Nix one, but I've heard good things about Nix. So
yeah,
you can try it out.
Check it out. Try it out.
Yeah. Okay. So how hot is too hot? Man, I guess the question is, it depends. So I was reading some different guides as to like the different, like what to kind of expect when you're training over certain temperatures. And it was interesting was like some of those heat effects can actually go in as soon as you cross like 59 degrees Fahrenheit. That's crazy. You know what I mean? Like some of these like training in heat. Yeah. For running, they were talking about that. And that would kind of add up to like, I'm sure you had some clients running Boston this past weekend or this past Monday. And a lot of people were talking about how the temperature fluctuated and it got kind of hot on them. I think the temperature was only like in the 60s. I don't think it got even to 70. But you can start to feel some of those heat effects even at that temperature, right? And that, I'm sure maybe that's intensity dependent. But you can have some effects of heat training at that. I think for most of us, you're really going to start to notice that difference depending on your sport, running versus cycling. I think once you get to like 85 and above, but I would say where you and I live, we have like the extremes, right? Like we're basically deserts. I think the only thing that differs between you and us is that we have a lot more humidity, but not quite as high as the temperature. And you guys are just more like raw heat. And so the thing what I was reading that said where you have to be really careful is where you're mixing the high heat with the high humidity. And the issue that you have here is that you don't get that evaporative cooling effect from your sweat. So you're going to be sweating buckets, but because it's so thick and sticky and humid in the air, there's so much moisture in the air already, you're not going to evaporate that you're not going to have the same cooling effect from your sweat as you would as if it's a dry heat, right? Dry heat has its own negative effects, but I didn't necessarily see like a hard line as to like, hey, this is when it's too hot to be exercising. Although I did find a research study that basically summarized in saying if it's above 80 degrees and humidity exceeds 70%, then you're going to find a very big drop in your performance. And so I was like, okay, well, let me do a little research to see like how does this compare to San Antonio in the summer? And that's basically like every day, June through August. It's basically like that. Like our humidity is super high, and the temperature is super high too. So, you you got to be really careful with when you're choosing to go out. So that's the only like hard line that I've found. I think personally, like, it's it's hard for me to put my finger on when would I'd say it's too hot to go out. Not necessarily for running. For running, I'm like, all right, if we're over like 92 or 93, I'd probably just rather do a treadmill run. On the bike, I could push it a little bit further because you get more of that cooling effect from the wind. So that's kind of the benchmarks that I use. What about you? Any benchmarks for when you're like, nah, dude, I'm not going out there?
If it was 90 degrees or 90 degrees is our benchmark in Arizona, I think I would only be able to ride about 3 months out of the year. And that'd be January, February, March, or June, or December, January, February, probably, honestly. But I mean, there's, have you ever heard of the wet bulb test, or like wet bulb testing for weather?
Mm-mm.
Have you heard of that at all? Okay.
Nope.
So
Nope.
essentially that's what they're basing this humidity on, is essentially, you've heard of like black flag days and stuff like that, red flag and yellow flag and orange. So there's yellow, orange, black, red, and then black. Black is like absolute no-go, you have to cancel a race and stuff like that. Essentially what it is it's a chart, and it combines the temperature and the humidity, and that's kind of what they're talking about when they talk about these like performance markers. Because the humidity is so low in Arizona, it has to be like 112, 110 plus in order for it to be any sort of like heat, like no-go time, which is kind of crazy to me. I don't tolerate heat very well, especially since that one incident of probably more than likely heat stroke. I just don't tolerate heat very well anymore. And so my personal threshold is like 105, and I'm like, okay, I can't anymore. 105 with like minimal, less than 20% humidity, because that's what Arizona is most of the time in the summer. Otherwise, though, and also too, it's just sun is so intense. That probably deters me more than the actual temperature, because I can go out and there are sometimes in the evenings it's still like 110 out at 8, 9 p.m. at night when the sun is down. And I can ride, and it's, don't get me wrong, I'm dripping in sweat, but it's much more tolerable in the evening and nighttime than it is per se like during the middle of the day when that sun is beating on you. But I don't know. I mean, if I can get up and get my butt out of bed, I'll try by all means to try and get out of there. But I think the biggest thing is not necessarily a certain temperature or a certain humidity marker, but I think also too it's the slow process of getting used to that heat acclimation, and then also to understanding the warning signs of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And I know you just recently looked these up, so I'm going to let you kind of talk about heat exhaustion and heat stroke, and I'll kind of pipe in at the end. But tell us a little bit about like some of those signs. Let's start with like heat exhaustion, like what that is, and then heat stroke and what that is, and kind of like what to do about it.
Yeah, so heat exhaustion is definitely more common, right? So if we're comparing heat exhaustion to heat stroke, you would have heat exhaustion first leading into a heat stroke, right? So heat exhaustion is probably some symptoms that a lot of us can resonate with, but going down the list here, kind of from going down the list here, it might start with feeling kind of faint or dizzy. You're still going to have excessive sweating, so it'd be very sweaty. Your skin color might get kind of pale and kind of clammy skin. You might have nausea or vomiting, which you could also have with heat stroke. In terms of your heart rate, you're still going to have a high heart rate, but the pulse is going to be a little bit weaker. So it's not going to feel as throbbing, but it is going to still be beating quick, if that makes sense. A lot of times it's going to be associated with muscle cramps as well. So again, something that some of us can resonate with if you've ever been training in high temperatures or in high heat. Okay, so these are the signs of heat exhaustion, right? So I think the big things to remember, feeling faint and dizzy, you're still going to be sweaty, maybe some nausea or vomiting, some muscle cramps. Like that should be your warning sign. Like, hey, we're testing the limits here. So if you have these, the way that you would address it is just by getting into a cooler environment. So going inside, calling a car if you need to come pick you up, but get in the cooler temperature. Basically, just start with fluid consumption, and then take a cool shower when that's available, or get a wet towel, put that on your neck, or something like that. Right, start the cooling process, and you want to start that once you start feeling those symptoms. Um, okay, now this can progress from heat exhaustion to heat stroke, right? So heat stroke is a medical emergency. So this is something that hopefully none of us, this doesn't happen to any of us, but it's good to be aware of these signs because, it might not be you, it might be a training partner, it might be a friend or somebody random on the trail, but this is what you want to be aware of. So with the heat stroke, the person might be confused. So like an altered consciousness. They might have a throbbing headache. So a lot more neurological symptoms there. They're not going to have sweating, so that's a big difference between exhaustion and heat stroke. So their body's going to be kind of dry, their skin's going to be dry. They're going to have a body temperature over 103 degrees, and the skin's going to be red and hot and dry. Okay, so that's another big difference. The other thing is, they could still have nausea or vomiting just with heat stroke. When it comes to their pulse, they're going to have a rapid and strong pulse, so a slight difference from heat exhaustion, and this person might actually lose consciousness if they're going through this. So again, if they're having these symptoms, like the big ones to look out for: throbbing headache, confusion, no sweat, hot, dry skin, nausea, like this is a medical emergency. So this is someone that you want to call EMS for, get the person into a colder place, start cooling them off. And the guide that I was reading said not to give them anything to drink at that time. I guess that probably depends on what stage you're at within this scale,
Do you know why?
right? Because you're not going to suddenly hit all of this. I actually don't. I was going to ask you why you want to do that.
Yeah, so don't give them anything to drink, and the main reason being is because if they go unconscious, they might actually vomit and then choke on their vomit, which sounds really gross, but that's essentially what happens. So if you get something too cold, it can cause a reaction. They can essentially try and vomit, and then if they become unconscious and vomit when they're unconscious, then they choke to death. And so that is the reason why you don't want to give them anything to drink.
Okay, good to know.
Good to know.
Stroke. I was reading that and I was like, yeah. Okay, good to know. So those are the big signs of it. I know that you've done some stuff with your SCS, right? Do you guys cover some of this treating heat exhaustion and heat stroke in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done so much training on this stuff because it does happen. And when I was in my residency, I worked at a local high school down in Tucson, and they obviously have football practice in August, and just like everyone else. And in August in Tucson, it is 105 to 110, and I mean, there's mandatory. They have mandatory breaks. We have ice bath there in case somebody does go down and stuff like that. And so there is a ton of this training. The important thing with heat stroke too is that you must cool them down ASAP. It is better you want to call 911, but you also want to cool them down before you transport them. So their temperature must be below 103 before you transport them, because more than likely you're going to have better ability to cool than the ER will. And so anyways, you're going to have ice, you're going to have water buckets, you're going to have other things like that at your disposal versus sometimes in the ER, obviously they don't have that. And so that is one really, really important thing, is that if you do have somebody who has heat stroke, and again, the biggest things for heat stroke is that they're not sweating anymore. They're starting to get confusion. They might be going in and out of consciousness, and then that rapid, strong pulse. Those are all big things to really watch for heat stroke, and you need to call 911 right away, and you need to cool them down ASAP. So those are really, really important things. Every year, people die in marathons because of heat stroke. They die in bike races because of heat stroke. Swimming, it doesn't happen as much because you're in the water, and that has the cooling effects of the water and being totally submerged in water, but it still can happen. So these are all really important things to know. And it's not necessarily to deter people from training in the heat, but it's just something that, like, these are really important warning signs to see. If you are sweating a ton and then all of a sudden stop sweating, you're in a bad place and you need to stop. You need to seek air conditioning and medical help right away, because that does happen, unfortunately. But
yeah. No, I think that's a good summary. And like you said, it's not to deter people, but it happens quick. So going from one being okay to not being okay can happen quickly. And just having, like what you said, I think was a good way to drive home the importance of needing to cool people down prior to transport. Like that's great. Like I didn't know that. And so thank you for sharing that, because that can make a big difference in like the overall effectiveness of treating this. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, cool, man. Any last thoughts on heat training?
I don't.
No, man. I think we hit it well. I think that sums up most of it. I think the big things, just gradually expose yourself, hydrate, know the signs of when you've gone too far, and know how to address it in the event that happens.
Yeah. One thing I think is the biggest thing is obviously hydrate, but also to start slow. Start slow. Go and get out for rides as the temperature gradually warms up this spring. Keep going outside and keep getting used to that temperature. If you do that, and if you're smart about it and hydrate, no problem with heat training. It should be actually beneficial for your training. So awesome. Thanks, Will. Thanks for another awesome episode about heat training today. That was definitely fun to talk about. I know, it's near and dear to both of us because we both deal with it all the time. But thank you, everyone, for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment on all platforms. We do throw it up on YouTube. Join there if you desire. Otherwise, if you really wouldn't mind, the best thing that you can do is share this podcast with a friend. That helps grow our audience, and that helps us get all this good information out to other people. So please share it with a friend. We'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, we will see you next time. Peace.
Thanks, y'all.